The photograph arrived at Adam Schiff's Senate office at 7:43 in the morning. It was delivered by courier, sealed in a manila envelope marked personal and confidential. His scheduler, a woman named Rebecca who had worked for him since his house days, brought it into his private office without opening it. She knew better than to open anything marked personal. Schiff was on a conference call with his communications team, planning the week's media appearances. He had 4 interviews scheduled: CNN on Tuesday, MSNBC Wednesday morning, a podcast on Thursday, and a Sunday morning spot on Meet the Press. The Russia investigation was still his signature issue, 7 years after it began. 7 years of being the face of accountability, the conscience of Congress, the man who had seen the evidence and wouldn't let America forget. He finished the call, reached for the envelope, and slid his finger under the seal. Inside was a single 8x10 photograph. Black and white, high resolution, professionally printed on glossy paper. It showed him sitting across from Chuck Todd on MSNBC. The date stamp in the corner read March 2017. He was leaning forward, his expression intense, his finger pointed at the camera for emphasis. The caption beneath the photo read, "More than circumstantial evidence." There was no note, no explanation, just the photograph and a small flash drive taped to the back. Schiff stared at the image. He remembered that interview. He remembered the certainty he'd felt, the conviction in his voice when he told Chuck Todd and 15 million viewers that the case for collusion was more than circumstantial. He'd believed it then. Or had he? The question had haunted him for years, late at night when the cameras were off and the only person he had to convince was himself. He pulled the flash drive free from the tape and turned it over in his fingers. It was unmarked, generic black plastic, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. He knew he shouldn't plug it into his Senate computer, basic security protocol. But he also knew, with the certainty that comes from decades in politics, that whoever sent this wanted him to see what was on it. And they'd sent it to arrive today, this specific Tuesday morning, for a reason. He inserted the drive into his laptop. A single file appeared, video, 12 minutes long. The file name was just a date, February 13, 2026, today's date. Schiff double-clicked. The video opened with his own face. Not the photograph, but live footage from 2017. Him on MSNBC with Chuck Todd, saying the exact words from the caption. "Actually, no, Chuck. I can tell you that the case is more than that, and I can't go into the particulars, but there is more than circumstantial evidence." Cut, same face, different show. CNN, December 2017. The Russians offered help. The campaign accepted help. The Russians and the campaign both sought to conceal help. That is, I think, the very definition of collusion. Cut, ABC, October 2017, George Stephanopoulos. A lot of that has been corroborated. He was talking about the Steele dossier. Cut, MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, November 2017. We are very close to a prosecutable case. The clips kept coming. CNN 2019. The evidence is in plain sight. ABC 2020. We now have ample evidence. Then the video changed. The editing shifted. Split screen now. On the left, Schiff making these claims. On the right, something else. Testimony transcripts. Sworn statements. Former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper. I never saw any direct empirical evidence that the Trump campaign or someone in it was plotting or conspiring with the Russians to meddle with the election. Former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, asked if she had evidence of collusion. Answer, no. Former National Security Advisor Susan Rice, same question. Answer, no. The video continued this pattern for 12 minutes. Schiff's confident assertions on the left, his own witnesses contradicting him under oath on the right. Then it ended with a black screen and white text. Senate Intelligence Committee hearing. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard. Today, 10:00 a.m. Hart Building, room 216. Schiff closed the laptop. His hands were steady. That was the first thing he noticed. After 24 years in Congress, 12 years on the Intelligence Committee, 7 years as the face of the Russia investigation, he had developed the kind of emotional control that makes a man's hands steady even when his world is about to collapse. But his mind was racing, running through scenarios, calculating moves the way a chess player calculates 3 steps ahead. Someone had compiled every television appearance he'd made about Russian collusion. Someone had edited them into a prosecution exhibit. And someone had paired them with the classified testimony he'd kept secret for over a year, testimony that contradicted everything he'd said on camera. And they were going to play it today, in a public hearing, in front of cameras and press and senators and the entire country. Rebecca knocked on his door. "Senator, your car is here. The hearing starts in 40 minutes. Schiff stood. He buttoned his charcoal suit jacket, straightened his blue tie, and picked up his briefing folder. Inside were 3 pages of questions designed to put Tulsi Gabbard on trial for politicizing intelligence. Questions about her declassifications, about sources and methods, about CIA objections and foreign partner relationships. Questions designed to frame her as a Trump loyalist using the intelligence apparatus for revenge. He'd spent the previous evening rehearsing these questions. He'd timed the pauses, practiced the camera angles, refined the dramatic beats. He knew exactly when to slow down for emphasis, exactly when to repeat a phrase for the clip. None of it mattered now, because Tulsi Gabbard had his receipts. She had the compilation. She had the transcripts. And she was about to do what no one had done in 7 years. She was about to hold up his own words against the actual record and let the American people see the gap. The drive to the Hart Senate office building took 11 minutes. Schiff sat in the back of his Senate vehicle, watching the monuments pass through tinted windows. Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, men who had built things that lasted, structures made of marble and principle and words that meant what they said. He thought about legacy. He thought about how history would remember him. Would he be the man who held Trump accountable? The man who stood up when others stayed silent? Or would he be something else? Something smaller and sadder and less noble? The car pulled up to the Hart building. Press was already gathered outside, cameras shouldered, reporters checking their phones. They didn't know yet. They thought this was going to be a routine oversight hearing. Democrats questioning Gabbard about declassification, Republicans defending her, the usual partisan theater. They had no idea they were about to watch a reckoning. Schiff exited the vehicle and walked through the entrance. His chief of staff, Patrick Boland, was waiting inside with a coffee and a grim expression. "Have you seen the video?" Boland asked. "I've seen it," Schiff said. "She's going to play it in the hearing. We've confirmed it through back channels. It's queued up and ready to go." "I know. We need a strategy." Schiff stopped walking. They were in the hallway outside the hearing room. Through the doors, he could hear the murmur of voices, the shuffle of people taking seats, the mechanical whir of cameras being positioned. "What's our strategy?" Boland pressed. "Do we walk it back? Do we claim context? Do we attack her credibility? Do we?" "There is no strategy, Patrick." Schiff's voice was quiet. "She has me on tape. She has my witnesses on the record. The only strategy is to survive it and hope the news cycle moves fast." "The mortgage investigation makes it worse, I know." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Boland said something that almost made Schiff laugh. "You could not show up and spend the rest of my career running from a hearing I didn't attend." "No, I'll face it. I've faced worse." He hadn't faced worse. He'd never actually faced anything like this. For 7 years, he'd been the prosecutor, never the defendant, the questioner, never the questioned, the man with classified access that gave him authority no one could challenge. But that was about to change. Because Tulsi Gabbard had declassified the documents, the witnesses were no longer in a classified vault where only he could access them. They were public record now, and she was about to read them in front of the entire country. Schiff pushed through the doors into the hearing room. The room was already at capacity. 30 senators on the raised dais, Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other. Press gallery packed with reporters. Public seating filled with staffers and policy observers, and people who had come specifically to watch what they suspected might be historic. Tulsi Gabbard sat at the witness table. She wore a dark navy suit, no jewelry, no accessories. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style. The aesthetic was deliberate, not politician, not partisan, military briefer, someone here to deliver facts. She didn't look at Schiff as he entered. She was reviewing notes in a thin manila folder. Next to her was a laptop and a flash drive. The same flash drive that had been delivered to his office that morning, or an identical copy. Either way, it didn't matter. The content was the same. Schiff took his seat 6 positions from the center of the dais. He placed his folder on the desk in front of him, poured a glass of water from the pitcher, and adjusted his microphone. His hands were still steady. That was something. Chairwoman Susan Collins called the hearing to order at exactly 10 o'clock. She read the opening statement in the measured tone of someone who had chaired hundreds of hearings and knew that the real drama never came from the opening statement. It came from the questions. The Select Committee on Intelligence will come to order. Today, we will hear testimony from Director of National Intelligence Tulsi, Gabbard, regarding recent declassifications of intelligence community documents related to the 2016 election and the origins of the Russia investigation. The first hour was procedural. Republican senators asked about process. Democrats asked about propriety. Gabbard answered each question in the clipped, precise language of an intelligence briefer. Facts, dates, legal authorities. No emotion. No editorial comment. Then it was Schiff's turn. He adjusted his microphone. He straightened his notes. He looked down at the witness table the way he'd looked at hundreds of witnesses before. The way a prosecutor looks at a defendant who doesn't yet know the trap has been set. Except this time, Schiff was the one who didn't know the trap. Or rather, he knew it existed but had no way to avoid it. "Director Gabbard," he began, reading from his prepared script because that's what you do when you're a skilled performer and you know the cameras are watching. In July, you declassified a House Intelligence Committee staff report from 2020 that had been kept classified by both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. You did so over the objections of CIA officials who warned, and I'm quoting from NBC News, that the level of detail exposed could alert Moscow to how intelligence was collected and potentially endanger sources. He paused for emphasis. He'd practiced this pause. 2 seconds, long enough for the words to sink in but not so long that it felt theatrical. Former CIA analyst Michael Van Landingham said he was, quote, shocked at what was revealed. My question is simple. Did you prioritize political impact over the safety of intelligence sources? It was a good question. The kind of question that should have put any witness on the defensive. The kind that should have forced Gabbard to explain and justify and ultimately retreat into the familiar territory of "I stand by my decision" without ever admitting fault. But Gabbard didn't retreat. She leaned toward her microphone and said, "Senator, thank you for the question. The decision to declassify was made in coordination with the President, who has constitutional authority over classification. I take the protection of sources and methods extremely seriously. As someone who served in a combat zone in Iraq, in Kuwait, on the Horn of Africa, my life depended on the quality and security of intelligence. I understand the stakes in a way that goes beyond the theoretical." Schiff interrupted, the way prosecutors interrupt when they smell blood. "With respect, Director, you didn't answer my question." "I'm getting there, Senator." Her voice didn't change. Still flat, still professional. "I wanted to establish my perspective on classified information because you've raised the subject of its sanctity, and I'd like to address that directly." She opened her manila folder. And that's when Schiff realized this wasn't going to be a hearing about Tulsi Gabbard's declassifications. This was going to be a hearing about Adam Schiff's lies. "On March 20, 2017, Gabbard said, reading from the folder, "you sat in this building, not this room, but the House equivalent. And during an Intelligence Committee hearing, you read allegations from the Steele dossier into the congressional record. The hearing room shifted, not dramatically. Hearings don't shift the way courtrooms do in movies, but there was a change in the quality of attention. Reporters stopped scrolling their phones. Senators stopped whispering to aides. Everyone was watching now. The Steele dossier," Gabbard continued, "was a collection of opposition research funded by the Hillary Clinton campaign through the law firm Perkins Coie and the research firm Fusion GPS. Its primary source, Igor Danchenko, was later charged by Special Counsel Durham with making false statements to the FBI. Danchenko himself told the FBI in January 2017, 2 months before your hearing, that his information was, and I quote, hearsay and just talk. She looked up from the folder, looked directly at Schiff. The FBI had already discredited the dossier's key claims and fired Christopher Steele as an informant by the time you read it into the congressional record. Inspector General Horowitz later found 17 significant errors and omissions in the FISA applications that relied on it. And yet you presented those allegations, unverified, debunked, sourced from Kremlin-linked gossip, as fact on the floor of Congress. In the permanent record. She paused, let the facts sit in the air like smoke. So when you ask me about the sanctity of classified information, Senator, I take the question seriously. But I'd respectfully note that the person asking it is the same person who entered fabricated intelligence into the congressional record and defended it on 200 television appearances. Schiff had prepared for this. He'd known the Steele dossier would come up. He had an answer. He'd used it before on The View, on CNN, in dozens of interviews. Director Gabbard, the Steele dossier was a matter of legitimate concern that warranted investigation. I stand by the committee's decision to examine its allegations. Senator, Gabbard said, and her voice was still flat, still professional, but there was something underneath it now, something harder. I'm not asking about the committee's decision. I'm asking about yours, your personal decision to read unverified claims into the permanent record, your personal decision to go on television afterward and tell Chuck Todd you had seen more than circumstantial evidence of collusion. Your personal decision to tell CNN that collusion was a fact. Your personal decision to tell Rachel Maddow you were very close to a prosecutable case. She turned a page in her folder. I'd like to tell you what the witnesses who testified to your own committee said under oath in closed session. Testimony you classified and kept secret until 2020. Schiff's jaw tightened. He could feel it happening, the trap closing, the walls moving in. Former DNI James Clapper, Gabbard read, quote, I never saw any direct empirical evidence that the Trump campaign or someone in it was plotting or conspiring with the Russians to meddle with the election. End quote. She turned another page. Former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates asked if she had evidence of collusion. Answer, no. Another page. Former National Security Advisor Susan Rice, same question. Answer, no. She closed the folder. Senator Schiff, you sat in the room when these witnesses said this. You had their transcripts. You classified them. You kept them secret for over a year and released them only when the White House threatened to do it first. And then, knowing what these witnesses had said under oath, you went on television hundreds of times and told the American people the opposite. The silence in the hearing room was complete. No shuffling papers. No whispered conversations. No camera shutters clicking, just silence and the faint hum of the ventilation system and the sound of Adam Schiff's political career beginning to unravel in real time. You didn't misspeak, Gabbard continued. You didn't exaggerate. You lied, deliberately, repeatedly for 7 years. And you did it while holding a security clearance that gave you access to the most sensitive intelligence in this country. Access you used not to inform the public but to deceive them. Schiff opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Gabbard said something that stopped him cold. And I can speak to this from a particular vantage point, Senator, because when you were making those claims, I was a member of the Democratic Party. I was serving in the House of Representatives. I was watching you do it. And what I saw, a colleague using classified access to deceive the public for political advantage, is one of the reasons I left the party. That was the moment when the partisan shield collapsed, because Gabbard wasn't a Republican operative. She wasn't a Fox News commentator. She was a former Democrat, a former colleague, a combat veteran who had served in Baghdad while Schiff was building his television career. And she was calling him a liar to his face in a public hearing broadcast, live to millions of Americans. Schiff regrouped. He was a former prosecutor. He knew how to absorb a blow and redirect. He leaned into his microphone and spoke with the controlled intensity of a man who had been doing this for a very long time. Director Gabbard, I appreciate the theatrical presentation, but let's be clear about what's happening here. You left the Democratic Party. You campaigned for Donald Trump. He rewarded you with this position. And now you're using the intelligence apparatus, the same apparatus you accuse me of politicizing, to conduct a political prosecution of a sitting United States senator. This isn't oversight. This is retribution. It was a good counterattack, the kind of response that should have shifted the narrative back to Gabbard's motivations, back to Trump, back to the familiar terrain of partisan warfare where Schiff had spent 7 years winning. But Gabbard didn't take the bait. She nodded slowly. Senator, you're right that I left the Democratic Party. Let me tell you why. Her voice shifted, not louder, deeper, the voice of someone accessing something real. In 2004, I was a state representative in Hawaii. 23 years old, I had just been re-elected. My unit, the 29th Infantry Brigade Combat Team of the Hawaii Army National Guard, was called up for deployment to Iraq. I wasn't on the mandatory roster. My commander told me I could stay home, keep my seat, keep my career. I volunteered instead. I became the first sitting state official in American history to voluntarily leave public office to serve in a war zone. She paused. The hearing room was absolutely silent. I served in a medical unit at Logistical Support Area Anaconda in Baghdad. I treated wounded soldiers. I read casualty lists every morning looking for names I recognized. The sign at the entrance to our base said, "Is today the day?" That was our greeting. Every day. For 12 months. Schiff sat motionless. He knew where this was going and he had no way to stop it. When I came home, I served in Congress as a Democrat for 8 years. I ran for president as a Democrat. I served on the Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. And what I saw, Senator, from the inside was a party that would say anything, use any institution, weaponize any piece of intelligence to maintain power. The Russia collusion narrative wasn't intelligence analysis. It was a political operation, and you were its chief architect. She looked directly at him. So no, Senator. I didn't leave because Trump recruited me. I left because of what I saw people like you doing with classified information. I left because I watched you go on television and claim you had evidence that didn't exist while the actual evidence, the testimony of your own witnesses, sat in a classified vault that you refused to open. I served in Baghdad while you served on CNN, and I take the integrity of intelligence more seriously than you ever have. Schiff's communications team, watching from a staff office on the 3rd floor, exchanged the look that political operatives exchange when they realize the playbook isn't working. His communications director texted Boland. He needs to pivot now. But Schiff didn't pivot. Schiff did what Schiff always does when a line of attack isn't working. He escalated. Director Gabbard, since you've raised the subject of credibility, let me remind you. Senator, Gabbard interrupted, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Since you've raised it, let me add to the record. She turned a page in her folder. September 26, 2019. You chaired a hearing on the Ukraine whistleblower complaint. In your opening statement, broadcast live to millions of Americans, you read what you presented as the president's words to President Zelensky. You said, and I quote, "I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent. I'm going to say this only 7 times, so you better listen good." She looked up. The president never said those words. Not in the transcript, not in any version of the call, not in any witness account. You fabricated them. When Representative Mike Turner confronted you, you said your reading was meant to be at least part in parody. She let the word hang in the air. Parody, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, the person entrusted with oversight of the most sensitive intelligence operations in the United States, fabricated presidential quotes during an impeachment hearing that was broadcast to the entire nation, and he called it parody. Schiff's face had gone through several phases during the exchange. Controlled composure, studied indifference, a flash of anger, and now something else. Something that looked, to the trained eye of the C-SPAN cameras, like the particular stillness of a man who realizes he is watching his own narrative collapse and has no way to stop it. Gabbard continued. 8 days before that hearing, September 17, 2019, you appeared on MSNBC. A reporter asked you directly whether you or your committee had communicated with the whistleblower. You said, and I quote, "We have not spoken directly with the whistleblower. We would like to." She turned another page. PolitiFact rated that statement false. Your committee staff had in fact communicated with the whistleblower before the complaint was filed. The whistleblower had approached your aide. Your aide had briefed you on the outlines of the complaint. You knew, and you said the opposite on national television. She closed the folder. Then, when the coordination between your staff and the whistleblower was publicly revealed, you reversed course. You had been demanding that the whistleblower testify publicly. Once the coordination was exposed, you blocked the testimony. You wanted transparency until transparency would expose you. Schiff opened his mouth, closed it. He looked to Chairwoman Collins, hoping she might intervene on time, but his 5 minutes weren't up. He still had time. The problem was that he had nothing to fill it with. Every prepared response. "I stand by the committee's work. This is a partisan distraction. The evidence speaks for itself," sounded hollow against the specific, dated, documented record that Gabbard was reading into this hearing the way he had once read the Steele dossier into his. "And since we're discussing patterns of credibility, Senator," Gabbard said, "I'll note one more item for the record. In May 2025, the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency submitted a criminal referral to the Department of Justice, alleging that you falsified bank documents and property records on 5 Fannie Mae loans between 2003 and 2019. The hearing room reacted. Not dramatically. Professional observers are trained not to react dramatically, but there was a collective intake of breath, a shift in posture, the kind of movement that happens when information crosses from rumor to official testimony. "The allegation," Gabbard continued, "is that you claimed your Maryland home as your primary residence on mortgage applications, while simultaneously claiming your California condominium as your primary residence for a homeowner's tax exemption, both at once, for 16 years. Fannie Mae's Financial Crimes Unit concluded you engaged in what they called sustained pattern of possible occupancy misrepresentation. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland has reportedly opened an investigation." She paused. "I don't know if you're guilty, Senator. That's for the Justice Department to determine. But I find it relevant to this hearing that a man who spent 7 years accusing a president of being compromised by a foreign power, based on evidence that his own witnesses said didn't exist, is now accused, with documentary evidence, of lying to banks to get better mortgage rates. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one had weight. This one had consequence." Schiff's voice, when he finally spoke, had lost its prosecutorial edge. It was tighter now, more defensive. "This is exactly what the Trump administration wants, using the intelligence apparatus to persecute political opponents. This is authoritarianism." "Senator," Gabbard said, and her voice remained flat, professional, unbothered, "I'd like to play something for the committee if the chairwoman permits." Collins nodded. Gabbard's aide pressed a button. The screens on either side of the hearing room lit up. And there it was, the compilation, Schiff's own face, his own voice. Clip after clip after clip. MSNBC, March 2017, more than circumstantial evidence. CNN, December 2017. The Russians offered help. The campaign accepted help. That is, I think, the very definition of collusion. ABC, October 2017. A lot of that has been corroborated. MSNBC, November 2017. We are very close to a prosecutable case. CNN 2019. The evidence is in plain sight. ABC 2020. We now have ample evidence. Year after year, network after network, the same claims, the same confidence, the same careful eye contact with the camera that had made him one of the most recognizable Democrats in America. Then the audio shifted. Flat, formal, the cadence of sworn testimony. Clapper, I never saw any direct empirical evidence. Yates, no. Rice, no. The screen went dark. Gabbard spoke into the silence. Senator Schiff has spent the last 7 years telling the American people that he had evidence of a conspiracy between a president and a foreign power. He didn't. He told them the Steele dossier had been corroborated. It hadn't. He fabricated presidential quotes in an impeachment hearing and called it parody. He lied about communicating with a whistleblower and then blocked that whistleblower from testifying when the lie was exposed. He read unverified gossip funded by a political campaign into the congressional record as fact. He kept witness transcripts classified for over a year because they contradicted his public claims, and only released them when forced. She paused, let each fact land. He was censured by the House of Representatives on June 21, 2023, by a vote of 213 to 209. He had to stand in the well of the House while the resolution was read aloud. That resolution stated, and I quote, that he abused this trust by alleging he had evidence of collusion that never existed, and he is now under federal investigation for mortgage fraud. Her voice didn't change, still flat, still professional. I served in Iraq. I know what real threats to this country look like. Mortars, IEDs, casualty lists. The sign that said, "Is today the day?" And I can tell you that the greatest threat to American democracy is not a foreign adversary. It is an elected official who uses the most sensitive information in this country to deceive the people who trusted him with it. She closed her folder. The documents I've declassified tell the truth. Senator Schiff has spent 7 years trying to prevent the American people from seeing that truth. Today they saw it. Chairwoman Collins waited 2 seconds. Then, "The senator's time has expired. Director Gabbard, thank you for your testimony." "Madam Chairwoman, I categorically reject," Schiff began. "The senator's time has expired," Collins repeated. "The committee will stand in recess for 15 minutes. The gavel fell. Schiff sat in his chair. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Senators standing, filing out. Staff moving through the aisles. The press gallery becoming a flurry of urgent typing and phone calls. Schiff did not stand. He sat perfectly still, looking at the blank screen where his own face had been playing moments ago. Patrick Boland approached from behind, leaned down, whispered something. Schiff shook his head. Not yet. He was thinking about the compilation. Not about its content, he'd heard every criticism before, but about its form, the side-by-side, his own face, his own voice, unedited, unmanipulated, playing next to the sworn testimony of people he'd supervised. There was no way to call it doctored, no way to call it taken out of context, no way to call it Russian disinformation or a Republican hit job. It was his words, on camera, on networks he chose, in interviews he requested, said with the confidence of a man who believed nobody would ever compile them and hold them up against the actual record. He thought about the Steele dossier. He'd read it into the congressional record on March 20, 2017. He remembered the moment. He remembered believing it, or telling himself he believed it, or telling himself it was worth reading because it might be true. The distinction between those three things had blurred years ago, and he'd never been forced to examine which one was real, because nobody had ever made him answer for it under these conditions. Not in a cable news interview where he controlled the conversation. Not in a friendly congressional hearing where the chairman was an ally, but in a room where a combat veteran with declassified documents and a flash drive full of his own television appearances was reading his record back to him like a court reporter, reading a transcript. Boland appeared again. "We need to get to the press room. The longer we wait, the worse it looks." "Give me a minute," Schiff said. He sat for another 30 seconds. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the hallway. The press conference happened 90 minutes after the hearing recessed. Schiff stood in the Russell Building hallway with his communications director and 2 sympathetic senators, and he delivered the statement his team had prepared during the break. "What you saw today," he said, "was the latest example of the Trump administration using the intelligence community as a weapon against its political opponents. Director Gabbard's performance was not oversight. It was political theater designed to distract from this administration's systematic dismantling of the institutions that protect our democracy." The words were right. The framing was right. The delivery was polished. But the problem was structural. Gabbard hadn't mentioned Trump once during the exchange. She hadn't mentioned the Republican Party. She hadn't mentioned any political agenda. She had read Schiff's own words back to him and compared them to the sworn testimony of his own witnesses. You can call that political theater, but you can't call it partisan when the evidence comes from the subject's own mouth. The clips went viral within the hour. Not the individual quotes, those had been circulated before. What went viral was the compilation, the side-by-side, Schiff's own voice making claims on the left half of the screen, his own witnesses denying those claims under oath on the right half. It was simple, it was devastating, it required no commentary. The contrast did the work. The first version to break was a 38-second cut. Schiff saying, "more than circumstantial evidence," followed immediately by Clapper saying, "no direct empirical evidence." It hit 20 million views by dinner time. By the next morning, it was at 53 million. The second clip that traveled was the Baghdad versus CNN exchange. Gabbard's voice, measured and flat. "I served in Baghdad while you served on CNN, and I take the integrity of intelligence more seriously than you ever have." Someone set it to a slow-motion video of Schiff's face as she said it. The expression, or rather, the careful absence of expression, the controlled blankness of a man who has just been hit in a place he didn't know was exposed, became a meme. The third was the parody takedown. Gabbard reading Schiff's fabricated Trump Zelensky quotes back to him, then the single word, parody. Someone overlaid a dictionary definition of parody on screen and added a question mark. It was shared 4 million times in 24 hours. Progressive media tried the familiar pattern. Gabbard turns hearing into political spectacle, ran the MSNBC chyron. Former Democrat uses DNI position to attack Schiff was the Huffington Post headline. But the compilation video made the coverage irrelevant. 53 million people had watched Schiff say, "more than circumstantial evidence," and then watched Clapper say, "no direct empirical evidence." The spin couldn't survive the side-by-side. The most unexpected reaction came not from Republicans or Democrats, but from former Democrats. People who had left the party over the past 4 years and saw in Gabbard a reflection of their own journey. A retired Army sergeant in Ohio posted a video that got 11 million views. "I left the Democratic Party in 2022 because of exactly what Gabbard described. They weaponized everything. Intelligence, the DOJ, the media. And Schiff was the face of it. I watched him say he had evidence for 3 years. He didn't. And I feel like an idiot for believing him." A veteran journalist, writing anonymously for a media criticism newsletter, published a piece that ricocheted through newsrooms. "I spent 3 years repeating Adam Schiff's claims about collusion evidence on air. He was my most frequent source. He was articulate, authoritative, and absolutely certain. And he was lying. I knew the intelligence community wasn't confirming his claims. I ran them anyway because he had clearance and credibility. He used us. We let him. That's on both of us." A former Democratic state senator from Michigan who had left the party in 2023 posted a thread that was shared 250,000 times. "I canvassed for Democrats using the Russia collusion story. I told voters their democracy was under attack by a foreign power. I believed Adam Schiff. Today I watched him sit in silence while his own words were played back to him. I feel betrayed, not by Republicans, by the man I trusted to tell me the truth." A Gold Star mother from Virginia called into a radio show and said something that was shorter and more devastating than anything said in the hearing room. "My son died in Afghanistan. Adam Schiff voted for the war. He said he had intelligence. Then he spent 7 years saying he had intelligence about Russia. Was that a lie too? How many things did he say he had intelligence about that turned out to be nothing?" The question hung in the air. Not because it had an answer, but because it revealed the nature of the wound. Schiff's credibility hadn't been damaged on a single issue. It had been damaged as a category. If a man will lie about having evidence of the most serious conspiracy in modern American history, if he will maintain that lie for 7 years on hundreds of television appearances while knowing his own witnesses contradicted him, then what can you believe him about? What can you trust? Where does the lying stop? In California, internal polls taken in the 2 weeks after the hearing showed a 7-point drop in Schiff's approval rating. Not because Californians suddenly supported Trump, but because the compilation video forced a simple question that no amount of spin could answer. If he lied about this, what else did he lie about? The mortgage fraud investigation continued quietly. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland had not yet announced any charging decisions, but the shadow of a federal investigation hung over every public appearance Schiff made. The irony was lost on no one. The man who had spent 7 years accusing a president of financial crimes was now himself the subject of a federal financial investigation. The man who had demanded transparency was now invoking the presumption of innocence. The man who had read unverified documents into the congressional record was now asking the public to wait for all the facts before reaching conclusions. The deeper damage wasn't in any single clip or headline. It was in the pattern that Gabbard had illuminated, a pattern so consistent, so documented, so visible in his own words on his own television appearances that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Claim to have evidence that doesn't exist. Read fabricated documents into the congressional record. Fabricate presidential quotes and call it parody. Lie about contact with a whistleblower, then block the whistleblower's testimony when the lie is exposed. Keep witness transcripts classified when they contradict your public claims. Claim 2 primary residences simultaneously for 16 years to save money on mortgages. And through it all, maintain the posture of a man defending democracy from its enemies, while systematically deceiving the people democracy is supposed to serve. Gabbard didn't call him a traitor. She didn't call him a criminal. She didn't call him a Russian asset, which would have been the kind of irony he deserved, but she was too disciplined to deliver. She called him something more precise, something that would be harder to shake, something that would attach to his name in the way that epithets attach to political figures when the public finally sees the gap between the performance and the record. She called him an architect of lies. 3 weeks after the hearing, Tulsi Gabbard sat in her office at ODNI headquarters in McLean, Virginia. She was reviewing an intelligence assessment on Chinese satellite capabilities. Routine work. The kind of work that doesn't trend on Twitter because it's classified. Her general counsel, Marcus Webb, knocked on the door. The Schiff clips just passed 80 million views. Gabbard didn't look up from the assessment. I saw. Press is asking for comment. I already gave my comment. The documents speak for themselves. So do Senator Schiff's own words. Webb sat down. You know what's interesting? We didn't have to exaggerate anything. We didn't have to take anything out of context. We just showed what he said on television next to what his witnesses said under oath. That's all it took. Gabbard signed the assessment and closed the folder. That's all it ever takes. The truth is usually pretty simple. It's the lies that require complex architecture. Do you think it changes anything? Changes what? The way people think about him. The way they think about what happened. Gabbard considered this. I think some people will never change their minds. They've invested too much in the narrative. But I think a lot of people, millions of people, watched that hearing and realized they'd been lied to. Not by their political opponents. By someone they trusted. Someone with classified access who told them he had evidence when he didn't. She stood and walked to the window. From her office she could see the parking lot, the security gates, the American flag on the flagpole. You know what nobody talks about? The damage it did to actual intelligence work. When you weaponize intelligence for political purposes, you undermine the entire system. You make people trust it less. You make sources less willing to cooperate. You make allies less willing to share information. You turn intelligence into another partisan tool instead of what it's supposed to be, an objective assessment of threats. She turned from the window. That's why I declassified those documents. Not to hurt Adam Schiff, to restore some measure of trust in the intelligence community by showing that when politicians abuse their access, there's eventually a reckoning. Webb nodded. The mortgage investigation is moving forward. DOJ confirmed it yesterday. I know. Do you think he'll be charged? I don't know. That's up to the prosecutors. But I'll say this. If a Republican had done what he did, claimed 2 primary residences for 16 years to get better mortgage rates, it would have been a major scandal. Front page news, calls for resignation. The fact that he's still in office says something about the double standard. She sat back down at her desk. But that's not my concern. My job is intelligence oversight. I did my job. The rest is up to the justice system. Webb stood to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I think you handled it perfectly. You didn't make it personal. You didn't make it partisan. You just showed his record. That's all anyone needed to see, Gabbard said. His record, his own words, his own witnesses. The truth doesn't require embellishment. After Webb left, Gabbard pulled up the compilation video on her computer. She'd watched it dozens of times during the preparation for the hearing, but she hadn't watched it since. She clicked play. There was Adam Schiff on MSNBC, March 2017, saying with perfect confidence, "More than circumstantial evidence." Cut to James Clapper under oath. "I never saw any direct empirical evidence." The contrast was stark, undeniable, the kind of evidence that doesn't require interpretation. Gabbard closed the video. She had work to do, intelligence briefings to prepare, threat assessments to review, the normal work of someone who takes classified information seriously. But before she returned to the briefings, she allowed herself a moment to think about what the hearing had accomplished. Not in political terms, that was for others to analyze, but in terms of accountability. For 7 years, Adam Schiff had used his position on the Intelligence Committee to make claims that he knew weren't supported by the evidence. He had gone on television hundreds of times and told the American people that he had seen proof of a conspiracy when his own witnesses had told him, under oath, that the proof didn't exist. He had classified those transcripts to keep them secret. He had fabricated presidential quotes and called it parody. He had lied about whistleblower coordination and then blocked testimony when the lie was exposed. And for 7 years, nobody had held him accountable in a way that couldn't be spun or deflected or partisan labeled away. Until now, because Gabbard had something that his previous critics didn't have. His own words on video, compiled and contrasted against the official record in a way that required no interpretation, no commentary, no political framing. Just Schiff saying one thing on camera, while his witnesses said the opposite under oath. The truth in split screen. That was the power of the compilation. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't spin. It was simply showing what happened in sequence without embellishment. And when you show the truth that clearly, the truth does the work. Gabbard returned to her intelligence assessments. There was a briefing scheduled for tomorrow morning on Russian cyber capabilities. The kind of real intelligence work that Schiff had once used his committee position to access, before he discovered that television appearances were more valuable than actual oversight. She read through the assessment, made notes in the margins, flagged sections for follow-up questions. This was the work, not the hearings, not the viral clips, but the quiet, classified, unglamorous work of understanding threats and advising the president and protecting American interests. The work that Adam Schiff had abandoned in favor of becoming a television personality, who used classified access as a credential rather than a responsibility. The work that Tulsi Gabbard had volunteered for when she left a safe house seat to serve in a war zone, because she understood that some things were more important than politics. The work that required trust, and the work that Schiff had damaged, systematically and deliberately, by weaponizing intelligence for partisan advantage. That was the real crime, not the lies themselves, though those were bad enough, but the damage to the institution, the erosion of trust, the transformation of intelligence from an objective assessment of threats into another partisan weapon. Gabbard finished the assessment and filed it in the secure folder. Tomorrow she would brief the National Security Council. The day after, she had a meeting with the CIA director about collection priorities. Next week, testimony before the Armed Services Committee. The work continued, but somewhere in America, millions of people were watching a compilation video of Adam Schiff contradicting his own witnesses, and they were asking themselves a question that couldn't be unasked. If he lied about this, what else did he lie about? That question would follow Schiff for the rest of his career. It would show up in town halls, in press conferences, in campaign appearances, in every interview where a reporter, having watched the compilation, would remember to ask the follow-up question. But Senator, your own witnesses said, you can recover from a lot of things in politics. You can recover from a policy failure. You can recover from a scandal. You can even recover from a criminal charge if you're acquitted. But you can't recover from being caught on camera, in your own words, systematically lying to the American people for 7 years while claiming to have evidence you knew didn't exist. You can't recover from that because the evidence isn't an accusation. It's your own voice, your own face, your own television appearances played in sequence against the sworn testimony of your own witnesses. And once 80 million people have seen that contrast, once they've watched you say one thing while your witnesses said another, once they've seen the gap between your public claims and the classified reality you kept hidden, the narrative is set. Not because your enemies said it, but because you said it yourself every time you went on television and lied with confidence, believing that nobody would ever compile all those lies and play them back in a Senate hearing room for the entire world to see. Adam Schiff built his career on claiming to have evidence he didn't have, on reading fabricated documents into the congressional record, on using classified access as a shield against accountability. And Tulsi Gabbard dismantled that career by doing something very simple. She showed his work. She showed the claims he made on television. She showed the testimony of his witnesses under oath. She showed the gap. And the gap told the story that no amount of spin could change. The architect of lies had been exposed by his own blueprints. And 80 million people had watched it happen in real time. In the days and weeks that followed the hearing, Adam Schiff continued to function as a United States Senator. He introduced legislation. He held press conferences. He appeared on Sunday morning shows. The machine of his political career continued to operate. But something fundamental had changed. It showed up in small ways at first. A reporter from CNN asking a follow-up question that wouldn't have been asked before the compilation video. A Democratic colleague declining to co-sponsor a letter. A progressive activist group removing his name from an endorsement list. The erosion was gradual but relentless, like water wearing down stone. Each interaction carrying the weight of the question that now attached to his name. If he lied about having evidence of Russian collusion for 7 years, what else has he lied about? His staff noticed it during a fundraising call. A major donor from California, someone who had supported Schiff since his house days, someone who had written 6-figure checks and hosted events and made phone calls, paused when asked for another contribution. I saw the hearing, the donor said. It was a political hit job, Schiff's finance director explained, using the talking points that had been developed and distributed and polished in the 3 weeks since the compilation went viral. I watched him say he had evidence, the donor said. I watched him say it on CNN, on MSNBC, on ABC. I believed him. I told people at dinner parties that Adam Schiff had seen classified intelligence proving collusion. I defended him when people called him a liar. There was a pause. And then I watched his own witnesses say, under oath, that the evidence didn't exist. That's not a political hit job. That's a video recording. The donor didn't contribute. And that conversation, or versions of it, happened dozens of times in the weeks after the hearing. Not because the donor base disappeared. Schiff still had strong support in California, still had millions in the bank, still had the infrastructure of a successful Senate campaign. But because the compilation video had done something that no political attack could do, it had created doubt, real doubt, the kind that couldn't be spun away because it came from Schiff's own mouth. The mortgage investigation complicated things further. In early March, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland convened a grand jury to examine the allegation that Schiff had misrepresented his primary residence on federal loan applications. The evidence was documentary, mortgage applications claiming the Maryland house as his primary residence. California tax records claiming the homeowner's exemption on the condo, which required it to be his primary residence. Both claims, simultaneously, for 16 years. Fannie Mae's internal investigation had found what they characterized as a pattern of misrepresentation. The Federal Housing Finance Agency had made a criminal referral, and now a grand jury was reviewing the case. Schiff's lawyers issued a statement. The applications were accurate at the time they were filed. The California exemption was an administrative error that had been corrected. There was no intent to defraud, but the timing was impossible to ignore. The man who had spent 7 years investigating a president for financial crimes was now being investigated for financial crimes himself. The irony was so perfect, so poetic, that even sympathetic media outlets couldn't help but note it in their coverage. By April, Schiff's approval rating in California had dropped 12 points. He was still popular. Incumbency and party affiliation are powerful forces, but the trajectory was clear. And more importantly, the nature of his popularity had changed. He was no longer the hero who stood up to Trump, the brave prosecutor who followed the evidence wherever it led, the conscience of Congress who wouldn't let America forget. He was now something else, something smaller, a politician who had been caught lying on camera and couldn't explain it away. The compilation video continued to circulate. By June, it had been viewed over 100 million times across various platforms. It had been parodied, remixed, analyzed, and dissected. But the core message never changed. Adam Schiff on camera saying he had evidence. His witnesses under oath saying the evidence didn't exist. The gap. In July, the grand jury in Maryland declined to indict. There wasn't enough evidence of intent, the U.S. Attorney's Office explained. The mortgage applications were technically accurate even if the pattern looked suspicious. Schiff held a press conference to announce his vindication. I have always maintained my innocence, and today's decision confirms what I have said all along. There was no wrongdoing. But the press conference was smaller than it would have been a year earlier. Fewer reporters, fewer cameras, and the questions afterward weren't about the vindication. They were about the compilation. Senator, in the Gabbard hearing, she showed video of you claiming to have evidence of Russian collusion, while your own witnesses said no such evidence existed. Do you stand by those television appearances? Schiff had prepared for this question. He'd been preparing for it since the hearing. I stand by the committee's work investigating a serious attack on our democracy. The investigation was justified, thorough, and necessary. But, Senator, the question is about your specific claims. You said on national television repeatedly that you had seen more than circumstantial evidence. Your witnesses said under oath that no such evidence existed. Were you lying, or were you mistaken? This was the trap, the question that had no good answer. If he said he was mistaken, he admitted to going on television for 7 years making false claims about having evidence. If he said he wasn't lying, he had to explain why his witnesses contradicted him under oath. I had access to classified information that informed my public statements, Schiff said. The context of those statements was clear to anyone who watched the full interviews. But Senator, Director Gabbard declassified the transcripts. We can all read them now. Your witnesses under oath said the evidence didn't exist. That's not a matter of context. That's a direct contradiction. Schiff ended the press conference shortly after. By August, polling showed that among independents, the voters who decide close elections, Schiff's favorability had dropped to 31%. Among Democrats, he was still strong at 72%, but the independent collapse was significant. More significantly, a challenger emerged. A progressive state senator from Los Angeles who announced a primary challenge based explicitly on the credibility issue. I believe in accountability, the challenger said at her announcement event. And I believe that when a public official uses classified access to make claims that turn out to be false, that official should be held accountable by voters. She didn't mention Schiff by name in her announcement speech. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who she was talking about. The primary challenge was serious, well-funded, well-organized, And it tapped into something real, the growing sense among progressive voters that the Russia investigation, which had consumed so much energy and attention and political capital, had been oversold by the very people who were supposed to be truth-tellers. Schiff had merchandise made, censured by MAGA Republicans, T-shirts and coffee mugs. He turned the House censure into a badge of honor, proof that he had fought so hard against Trump that Republicans had to officially punish him. But the compilation video undermined that narrative, because the video didn't show Republicans accusing Schiff of lying. It showed Schiff's own witnesses, under oath, contradicting his public claims. You can sell persecution when your accusers are your enemies. It's harder to sell persecution when your accusers are your own witnesses from your own committee testifying under oath. The primary was scheduled for June 2026. Schiff poured money into the race. He brought in national figures to campaign for him. He ran ads highlighting his record of standing up to Trump, his work on the Intelligence Committee, his decades of public service. But his opponent ran one ad that cut through all of it. The ad was simple. It showed Schiff on MSNBC saying more than circumstantial evidence. Cut to Clapper saying, no direct empirical evidence. Then text on screen. He had access to classified information. He went on TV and lied. Is that who you want representing California? The ad ran for 2 weeks before Schiff's campaign got it pulled for copyright issues. But by then, it had been viewed millions of times online, and the message had landed. The primary results came in on June 3, 2026. Schiff won, but narrowly, 52% to 48% against a challenger who had been polling at 15% when she announced. It was a win, but it was the kind of win that signals vulnerability, the kind that makes other challengers take notice, the kind that makes donors nervous. And more importantly, it was a win that came with a cost. Because to defeat the primary challenge, Schiff had spent $8 million and burned through favors and political capital that he would need later. All because a combat veteran from Hawaii had spent 12 minutes in a Senate hearing room showing the American people what Adam Schiff had said on television, compared to what his witnesses had said under oath. By the fall of 2026, the compilation video had become a case study in political science classes. Universities were teaching it as an example of how credibility, once destroyed, cannot be rebuilt. How in the age of video and social media, a politician's own words become the most powerful evidence against them. The case study wasn't about Tulsi Gabbard's questioning technique, though that was analyzed. It wasn't about the declassification decision, though that was debated. It was about the power of showing rather than telling. The power of letting a subject's own words contradict themselves. The power of the compilation. Because before the hearing, the accusations against Schiff were just that. Accusations. Partisan claims that could be dismissed, spun, reframed. But after the hearing, after the compilation, the accusations became evidence. Video evidence. Evidence that required no interpretation, no trust in the accuser, no political affiliation. Just Adam Schiff saying one thing while his witnesses said another. And once 80 million, then 100 million, then 120 million people had seen that evidence, the narrative was set. Not by his enemies, by himself. Every time he went on television and said more than circumstantial evidence. Every time he told Rachel Maddow he was close to a prosecutable case. Every time he told CNN that collusion was a fact. He was building the case against himself, clip by clip, network by network, year by year. He just didn't know it until Tulsi Gabbard played it all back in a Senate hearing room. That was the genius of what Gabbard did. She didn't attack Schiff. She didn't need to. She just pressed play. And let Adam Schiff, in his own words, in his own voice, on his own chosen television appearances, convict himself in the court of public opinion. An architect of lies, exposed by his own blueprints. A prosecutor, undone by his own evidence. A man who spent 7 years claiming to have seen classified proof of a conspiracy, destroyed by the sworn testimony of his own witnesses, saying that proof never existed. The hearing lasted 3 hours, but the reckoning would last the rest of his career. Because you can survive a lot of things in politics, but you cannot survive being caught, on camera, in your own words, systematically lying to the American people while claiming the authority of classified access. You cannot survive that because there is no spin sophisticated enough, no narrative powerful enough, no political coalition loyal enough to overcome the simple truth of a side-by-side video showing you saying one thing while your own witnesses say another. The truth in split screen. That was Adam Schiff's legacy now, not the investigations he led, not the hearings he chaired, not the speeches he gave, but the compilation, the video, the evidence, his own words, his own witnesses, the gap. And 80 million people watching that gap, and finally understanding what Tulsi Gabbard had known from the beginning, that the greatest threat to democracy isn't foreign interference or partisan warfare or institutional dysfunction. It's a public official who uses classified access to deceive the people who trusted them with it. Adam Schiff had been that official. And on February 13, 2026, in a hearing room in the Hart Senate office building, a combat veteran from Hawaii made sure the American people would never forget it.